Good evening. I'm Stephanie Herseth-Sandlin, President of Augustana University. On behalf of the Center for Western Studies, thank you for being with us tonight for the 24th Boe Forum on Public Affairs, the first presented virtually. As with past forums, we trust you'll find this evening's speakers and the topic that they will address to be both enlightening and compelling. As we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank Mr. Chuck Wise, Chair of the Board of Directors for the Center for Western Studies, and other members of the board for their leadership and service. Dr. Harry Thompson, Executive Director of the Center for Western Studies, and all of the CWS staff for their board for their work in planning tonight's event. Renelle Thompson, Director of the Mickelson Library, Craig Johnson, Media Librarian, and all of the library staff who are providing technical expertise and support, and Augustana's faculty, administrators, staff, and students. Since its inception in 1995, the Boe Forum on Public Affairs has sought to provide the people of this region with access to global thought leaders who can address events or issues of worldwide or national concern and of broad public interest. It's been a privilege for us to host some of the most influential voices of our time. Most recently, Pulitzer Prize winning journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and former US Secretary of State, Dr. Condoleezza Rice. Along with the Center for Western Studies, we're eternally grateful to former South Dakota Governor Nils Boe and his family for entrusting us to carry out their wishes as they relate to informing engaging citizens on matters that influence and affect the nation and the global community. In 2016, Augustana University, in collaboration with Sanford Imagenetics, launched a master's degree program in genetic counseling. At the time, it was one of only 32 such programs in the country. Augustana alumnus, Dr. Jean Hoyme, a nationally recognized and award-winning authority on clinical genetics and fetal alcohol syndrome, and the recipient of the Spirit of Augustana Award for Research and Innovation, led the development of Sanford Imagenetics and was instrumental in creating the collaborative program in genetic counseling. During an interview for the Augustana magazine, Dr. Hoyme said, quote, "The reality is that genetics has evolved into an important daily tool that will help every physician care for their patients as one of the many tools that physicians use. In my mind, it's probably one of the most important steps in medicine that's occurred since antibiotics," unquote. This evening's speakers bring insights to the many ways genetics may continue to shape medical research and healthcare delivery around the world as they present Are We Ready? The Science, Ethics, and Geopolitics of Genetic Engineering and Preventive Genomics. Dr. Robert C. Green is a physician scientist and professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and directs the Genomes to People research program at Brigham and Women's Hospital and the Broad Institute. He's an internationally recognized leader in conducting research and developing policies to accelerate the implementation of genomic and precision medicine. Dr. Green led the first experimental trials disclosing genetic risk for common complex disease and the first prospective studies to evaluate outcomes in direct-to-consumer genetic testing services. He also established the world's first comprehensive family-oriented preventive genomics clinic in Boston. Dr. Green is a board member of the Council for Responsible Genetics and works within the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health and the All of Us research program on designing efforts to return research information, particularly genomic information, to research participants. Dr. Jamie Metzl is a leading futurist who specializes in making revolutionary science understandable to the general public. His latest book, Hacking Darwin: Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity, explores the many ways genetic engineering is shaking the core foundations of our lives. Dr. Metzl is a senior fellow for technology and national security with the Atlantic Council, a faculty member for Singularity University's Exponential Medicine track, and an expert in international affairs and biotechnology policy. He was recently appointed to the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on developing global standards for the governance and oversight of human genome editing. Dr. Metzl is a founder and co-chair of the National Security Organization Partnership for a Secure America, and a member of the advisory board of the Brandeis International Center for Ethics, Justice, and Public Life. Dr. Green and Dr. Metzl's examination tonight into the relationship between genetics and health, the ability to predict and thereby prevent disease, and the geopolitics of genetic engineering and genomics is sure to be informative and thought-provoking. We are very grateful to Drs. Green and Metzl for being with us virtually and for their patience and understanding as we worked within the confines of the pandemic to reschedule the 24th Boe Forum on Public Affairs. Please join me in welcoming them both, and we'll begin with Dr. Robert Green.
All right. Thank you very, very much. Let me know if you're not hearing me. Everything coming through okay? All right, fantastic. Well, folks, President Sandlin and Harry Thompson and all of you who are tuning in, it is such a pleasure to be here. I wish I could be there. And I know of what I speak because I've been there working in a consulting capacity with the Sanford Imagenetics program. I don't think all of you realize that the Sanford healthcare system has one of the leading genetics prevention and prediction programs in the world underway. And it's been my privilege to visit there regularly and offer some assistance to them as they develop their outcomes in this incredible project. I'm going to speak to you now for about 25 minutes about the subject of Are We Ready for Preventive Genomics? And I'd like to thank the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Defense, and the Franca Fund for Preventive Genomics for financial support, and also let you know my one conflict of interest, which is that I've co-founded a company called Genome Medical, which is a telemedicine genetics company. Now, the topic is, are we ready? And my answer is, we are so close. It was just about exactly 20 years ago in February of 2001, where the first draft of the Human Genome Project was finally completed. 3 billion chemical letters of DNA. And at that time, the cost of that sequencing was $3 billion. Today, as most of you know, it's fallen to about $300, or a 10 million times reduction. So let's imagine that this is a car. What's the most expensive car in the world today? I had to look this up. It's the Bugatti La Voiture Noire, and you can pick it up for the low, low price of about $18.7 million. If we reduce the price of that car the way we've reduced the cost of sequencing, you could buy that car now for $1.87. But what's even more amazing is the value of the genome has only gone up over time. It's been heralded rightly as one of the most miraculous and fertile resources, and there's no doubt that amazing discoveries have been made, treatments to treat cancer, improvements in diagnosis of rare diseases. But the question I want to concentrate on tonight, and I will say that Dr. Hoym has been one of the leaders in this whole arena and established part of the Sanford Imagenetics program, as well as your genetic counseling program. But what the question I want to ask you to contemplate with me tonight is, why isn't your doctor offering you the ability to get your genome fully sequenced and interpreted? For those of you who have children, I want to ask you, why didn't your OBGYN offer you recessive carrier testing before you got pregnant, so that you could avoid even the small percentage of cases where you would have a congenitally devastated child? And for those of you who are planning to have a baby, why isn't your pediatrician coming to you and saying, do you want this child sequenced? Because that can provide you with a blueprint for that child's entire future. Tonight, I'm going to try to share with you the obstacles that I've observed and the answers, partial answers, that I and others have uncovered to these questions. And what I think must be done before we can truly fulfill the promise of genomics to every human being on the planet. Now, I know there's a lot of genetics experts out there in the audience tonight, so bear with me for 2 minutes while I catch everybody else up. I just want to remind people that a gene is the unit of DNA that has the blueprint for proteins that are building blocks of your entire body. And that we humans have about 20,000 genes, and they only take up about 2% of the DNA, which is made up of all sorts of other interesting regulatory elements. And there are about 5,000 of these 20,000 genes that we are pretty sure are associated with human disease. And the third point I want to say to make sure you understand the basics is I want you to understand the difference between array technology, chip technology, and sequencing technology, because everybody who's not in genetics gets these confused. Array technology is about, 500,000 or 1 million markers along the genome. That sounds like a lot, but it's not really very much compared to the entire sequence. Companies that are consumer facing like Ancestry.com and 23andMe do a really good job of farming information out of those markers as they go along. And in some cases, a few healthcare systems like Sanford are actually using chips to get started with human genomic screening. So chips are fine, but you need to understand that there's 1,000 times more information in a sequence, which is every single chemical letter of your DNA. And particularly if you and your family have a unique mutation in one of these disease-associated genes, the only way you're going to ever pick it up is with sequencing. And sequencing is now costing somewhere between $300 and $500 to sequence, and several $100 to $1,000 more to interpret. So depending how you measure it, we've come down below the $1,000 genome, and we're rapidly approaching the $100 genome, or maybe even the free genome. So we're using the fruits of genomics everywhere. And I'm not going to speak about that today. I'm going to speak about where we're not using it. We're not yet using it in population health. And I think there are 3 dominant narratives that explain, in part, why we're not using it already. One is the narrative of catastrophic emotional distress. The idea that when somebody learns that they have a genetic risk for something, they're going to become so anxious, so depressed, they might even get suicidal, or if it's their child, you're going to disrupt and completely destroy the parent-child relationship, or put that child in some kind of Greek mythology hell, where the sword of Damocles of information is hovering over their head and they can never escape it. We've tested the narrative of catastrophic emotional distress for 20 years over 6 different NIH-funded randomized clinical trials. And you know what we've learned? Not to treat this cavalierly, because people can always get upset. But there is a fundamental difference when someone comes to you because they have an illness that they didn't want to have, and you reveal to them genetic information that they didn't really want to know, and someone who seeks you out to find out genetic information that they really want to know about. There's something really different about those 2 scenarios. And what we found is that the people who present themselves for genetic information, present themselves to learn information, who are information seekers, those people actually have almost no distress whatsoever. It's hard to believe. You can disclose to them that they are at cancer risk, that they're at risk for sudden cardiac death, that their baby has a cardiomyopathy risk, and they just tend to take it pretty well. We can measure the degree of anxiety, we can watch it go down over a few weeks. And then many of them start to look for what they can do about it, how they can change their lifestyle, how they can surveil. So the 3 projects that are sort of our flagship projects has been the REVEAL study, where we spent 15 years teasing apart the ways in which we gave people risk information for Alzheimer's disease, completely untreatable, scary as hell. The MedSeek project, where we were the first ones to disclose comprehensive, multi-domain genetic information to adults, ostensibly healthy adults, and the BabySeq project, where we were the first ones to offer genome sequencing in all its glory and messiness to healthy newborn babies. And I would postulate that we have really rebutted the narrative of emotional distress, and that although it can happen, if we try to reject the exceptionalization of genomics, if we bring it into the fold with all the other medical information, people will learn to see it as a risk factor, and they will learn to use it in their day-to-day health. Now, the second narrative is that genomics is too complicated and clinicians are all unprepared. Okay, to some extent, this is true, but we've done things to mitigate this. For example, in 2013, I got the privilege of leading an American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics working group to define the top genes that we thought were actionable. And of those 5,000 genes that I told you about that are associated with human disease, we found 56 which we thought were the most actionable. These are the ones when we sat around the table, we said, I don't know if I could sleep at night if I knew this about you and I didn't tell you. And that list has gone to 59 and it's soon going to go to 74. But the point is it's way less than 5,000. So if you want to get started with a set of genes that we think we can do something about, that we think we know a lot about, you don't have to take on the entire genome. You don't have to take on the entire field of genetics. You can start with a limited list of highly actionable conditions and work from there. The other thing we proved in the MedSeq and BabySeq study, at least to start with, is that primary care adult doctors and primary care pediatricians could handle it. This was no Jack Nicholson moment, you can't handle it. This was pediatricians and adults, primary care docs who dove in, learned to interpret a one-page genetic report of an entire genome, just like they've learned to interpret a chem lab test or a radiology report. They didn't have to become nuclear scientists to interpret that. They just had to learn how to read it, master the vocabulary, understand the implications, and have backup in the form of genetic expertise. So I would say we're on our way to rebutting that narrative as well. And the third narrative that's really obstructed population genomics is that this is some kind of existential threat to privacy and basically an invitation to discrimination, and especially insurance discrimination. And I would argue that history has thus far shown us that that simply isn't true. We can probably count on my fingers and toes all of the examples in which a genetic database has been breached, and we can probably count on another set of fingers and toes at the most, all of the examples where an insurance company has actually utilized genomic information to underwrite at a different rate. So I'm pretty excited about reassuring people in terms of their privacy and their fears of discrimination. It's certainly going to be something that's hovering over us for a long time, but we've had federal laws to protect against health insurance discrimination and employer discrimination, and the state of Florida just passed the toughest law yet to protect against life insurance and disability insurance discrimination. So I believe that state by state will make progress on this, but just realistically, this threat isn't anywhere near the threat that people can get off of your credit cards, off of your search histories, and off of all your social media in terms of invading your privacy. And most of those things don't have the counterbalance of potential medical health. So those are the three narratives that I think are obstructing us, and why I think they are not necessarily as big an obstacle as we have been led to believe. Now, those of you in the audience who are in genetics may know this, but who are not may be wondering, well, what's in my genome? What would I find if I got myself sequenced? And believe it or not, there's only a few scientists and a few centers that have actually sequenced individuals and given that information back to them to use in their medical care. We're not the only ones, but we're one of the few. I'd say in the history of the world, there's only been about 10,000 people who've been fully sequenced, comprehensively interpreted, and had the information plugged into their healthcare. You're part of a rare group of pioneers if you're one of those. So there are 4 domains of medical information that I think you can get out of a genome today. One is your monogenic dominant risk. So these are conditions like BRCA1 that Angelina Jolie made famous for breast and ovarian cancer, cardiomyopathy, sudden cardiac death, all sorts of kidney diseases, skin diseases, eye diseases, hearing loss, even rare forms of neurodegenerative disease. Some are treatable today, some are in clinical trials, some will be treatable tomorrow or 10 years from now. I would argue that for those who want to know, there's always a reason to find this information out, and we should never disparage them because today we don't have a particular treatment for that condition. That's monogenic dominance. Monogenic recessives are those recessive carriers that we all carry that don't do anything bad to us, but they can be combined with our partner to give devastating problems in our children. Now, each of us, if you can believe it, carries anywhere from 2 to 10 of those. And luckily, when we have a partner and we make a baby, it's not the same 2 or 10 that our partner has. But you know what we're relying on for that? We're rolling the dice. And there's no reason in this day and age we should be rolling the dice about which recessive carriers we hold. 90% of you are carrying at least 1 to 2 recessive carrier mutations. The third category is pharmacogenomics. This is a natural for doctors, right? We love our drugs. We love prescribing drugs. We love anything that would make us prescribe drugs better. So whether it's starting at a higher or lower dose in order to avoid overdosing or underdosing because you have a metabolism that's faster or slower for that particular drug, or whether it's a particular genetic marker that gives you a side effect that you really don't want to have. Pharmacogenomics is going to be applied to drugs. And I must say, I'm really admiring what Sanford and other centers around the country are doing, plugging this in to their electronic healthcare system so that when you order a drug, you can immediately get a pop-up decision support matrix that says, have you thought about starting at a higher dose? Or have you thought about starting a different drug? So this is a natural, really the first one that health systems tend to reach for. And then there's a cool new area, the fourth category of genomic information, which is old again, new again, polygenic risk scores. And I say old and new because the direct-to-consumer companies actually launched these in 2007 as they got started with their offerings. But polygenic risk scores have come a long way. There is thousands of markers that are being computationally put together in a way that creates a bell curve. And by chance, or by having good parents, you can be way out here on the risk end of the curve. In other words, you're at really high risk, or you can be way out on the other end of the curve at really low risk. And the question that's facing us now, and that where most people are moving, is what kind of cutoff do we want to say people should start paying attention? The top 5% of risk, the top 2% of risk, the top 1% of risk? If you're at the top 2% of the risk curve right now on about 6 to 10 different conditions that have been studied with genome-wide association studies, you're already at 2 to 5 times the risk of the people in the median of the curve or at the low end. So that's a pretty big risk differential. And most people would want to know that. And these are common diseases: heart disease, atrial fibrillation, type 2 diabetes. These are things we know how to do something about. And these are things we can put extra attention onto if we know you are someone who's at risk for these. And believe it or not, if you just want to ask who's in the top 2 percentile for at least one of these, it's about 40 to 50% of people. So 15% of people with monogenic dominant, 90% of people with monogenic recessive, 50% of people with polygenic risk in the high part of the curve on at least one condition, and 80% of people with an atypical response to pharmaceuticals. This, folks, is not rare disease anymore. This is your life, this is human health, and this is something we should be paying attention to from the very first day you're born to the day you die. All right, I'm going to wrap up in a minute, but before I do that, I want to tell you my dream, what we'd like to work on next. And we're lucky enough to get refunded for our BabySeq project, the first project to sequence newborn babies. And we're going to be funded for about 500 families at 3 sites. And one of the things we're going to focus on is trying to address the diversity problem in genomics. As many of you know, particularly in the polygenic risk scores, these curves I was so happy talking about have been created almost exclusively out of people of European ancestry. And the curves are different in people of different ancestries. So there's already a huge health disparity in our country for all sorts of socioeconomic reasons. And there's probably even more of a disparity in folks who seek out genetic care. And there's even more disparity in folks who volunteer for research projects, particularly research projects in genomics because of historical injustices like Tuskegee and Henrietta Lack's story. These are things which resonate powerfully among the diverse parts of our society, and they are creating what some people have called genomic apartheid. And we cannot let this happen. We have to do whatever is necessary to collect the data from diverse populations, create these curves for all ancestry groups, and be able to deliver genomic benefits to everyone, regardless of race, regardless of socioeconomic status. And that's going to be a tough order because lots of companies are jumping into this space. Typical payers are not paying or not reimbursing, are not even close to reimbursing for preventive genomics. And that means that the people who are starting to purchase these in the consumer market, the people who are starting to get ahead, are the people who purchase from consumer-facing companies, whose rich employers purchase this for them, or whose, I don't know, whose insurance companies perhaps would get it for them after they're already in book. So we're talking about the haves getting lots and lots of genomics and the have-nots getting left behind. I'm really excited about our second stage BabySeq project because it is going to be committed to enroll minority families. And our dream is to expand that from 500 families to 5,000 families, and to expand it from following those babies for 1 to 2 years, which our NIH grant is paying for, to following them for 10, 15 years, perhaps their entire life. Imagine a kind of longitudinal Framingham study that's made up of infants who volunteered, whose parents volunteered them to be sequenced at birth, and then are scientifically followed for their medical outcomes, their behavioral outcomes, and their economic impact. And that's the national BabySeq project that we are hoping to explore in the next year or so. So my 25 minutes is about up. I think I'll wrap up here and turn it back over to my hosts and to Jamie for the next segment. But I'm looking forward to your questions and to the discussion that will follow. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Robert, and thanks so much to President Sandlin and to all of my friends at Augustana University. Sitting here before we began this event, I saw all the wonderful photographs of the incredible beauty of your university, and I had two thoughts. First, I felt sadness that I'm not able to be there with you. And I felt a sadness just seeing the empty auditorium, seeing the emptiness of the university. We're so used to being in environments where we celebrate our togetherness that I think we need to recognize that this pandemic has been a painful moment for all of us. But I'm also so appreciative that we've found new ways to come together, to find community, even in this time of difficulty and darkness. And I think that that is a good metaphor for the bigger world that's around us. This last year has been a year of incredible pain. We've all lost people we know. We've seen our lives disrupted. We've seen the most vulnerable people in our communities and around the world face incredible hardship, even greater than many of us. And we need to mourn that loss. But we also need to recognize that this is an incredible moment. In many ways, it's a defining moment for all of us. And given the history of Augustana University and what your university stands for, and given the high profile of this speaker event and the essential role that the kinds of people you've had play in allowing us and facilitating the kind of essential conversations that we need to make sure we can navigate these dangerous moments, is really now more important than ever before. So before I talk about the genetics revolution and its biggest and broadest implications, I just want to say a few words about this moment, because it's moments like these that define us. It defines us individually, it defines us communally, nationally, and globally. And in spite of all of the hardships that we face, it's my hope that in everything that we do in this time of difficulty, we'll be able, when we get through this, to say, you know, it was a really rough time, but I did my bit. I tell people to imagine yourself 90 years old and you're visiting your great-grandchild or your grandchild's, pick what you want, middle school, high school, whatever. And they announce that you are coming to speak to students about your experience of the great pandemic of 2020 and 2021. And every day of our lives right now, we are building those stories, building the stories of how we hopefully rose to the occasion on so many different levels. And part of doing that is understanding the context in which we are operating. And certainly there is the context of the pain, but there also is the context of the incredible pregnancy opportunity of this moment. If I were looking at all of you in the auditorium, I would ask you to raise your hand if you have been vaccinated. And my guess is many people in the auditorium will have now been vaccinated, and that most of you will have received either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccines. But to understand what is happening with those vaccines is to understand the incredible magic of the genetics and biotech revolutions. Maybe some of you remember from your childhoods the polio vaccine, which was an attenuated virus vaccine, meaning we have a weakened version of the polio virus that's injected into you, and then your body has an immunological response. That's what the Chinese vaccine is doing now. But the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are fundamentally different. These are called messenger RNA vaccines, mRNA vaccines. Actually, they are synthetic messenger RNA vaccines. And what that means is we are printing genetic code. As Robert said, genetics are a form of instructions telling your cells to make proteins. And the cells, the genome, passes the message through the messenger RNA to the cells to make those proteins. And what we're doing with these vaccines is hijacking that process by giving another set of instructions to your cells. And what we're asking your cells to do is to create something that doesn't normally exist in your body. Maybe you have seen the pictures of the SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus, and it has these little spike proteins, these little spikes that stick out. So what the mRNA vaccines are doing is giving your cells instructions to make those little spikes, something that doesn't exist in your body. And then your body mounts an immunological response to these foreign objects. And that's how you get your immunity. So think about this. How do we have the ability to make that kind of intervention? It's decades, in some cases, centuries of work, understanding the machinery of cells. And then it's understanding with great specificity the genome and genetics and the genetic code that makes up the DNA and, in this case, the RNA. So we are hijacking information with new information, turning each of our bodies into individualized manufacturing plants to create these spike proteins that our body then reacts against. This is magic, not just compared to what we could have imagined 100 years ago, but compared to what we could have imagined 20 years ago, because the pace of change in this field is not linear. As Robert said with his example of the car, it's not just the cost that's going down, it's the cost is going down and the power is going up, not just linearly, but exponentially. And that means that we all need to start thinking like science fiction writers, because if we gauge the rate of change going forward by the rate of historical change, we are going to make far too conservative calculations. And that brings me to the core point. What is the core message of this moment where the genetics and biotech revolutions are taking flight? And that is this. And if you remember one thing from this talk, this is it. After billions of years of evolution, our one species of all the species that have ever lived, we suddenly and increasingly have the ability to read, write, and hack the code of life, the genetic code of life, not just our DNA, but the DNA of all living beings. We have, in many ways, the ability that for millennia we have ascribed to our gods, the ability to recast, perhaps even extend all of life. And the question for us, perhaps it's the question of Mary Shelley and writers and thinkers for a long, long time, is will we have the wisdom to use these Promethean technologies wisely? This is a conversation about science. It is a conversation about technology. But at its core, this is a conversation about ethics, about whether we can apply our most sacred and valued ethical frameworks to guide the application of our most powerful technologies. And those technologies are going to be racing forward as we move. And we're even seeing it now with these mRNA vaccines that I mentioned. When the first sequenced genome of the SARS-CoV-2 virus came out of China in January of last year, guess how long, again, because I can't see everybody, but you can do it in your head, guess how long it took from when that sequence arrived to when the formulation that is the Moderna vaccine that many of you have already taken was created. So if you guess, you have to guess in your head, and I'll tell you, it was 48 hours, 2 days from receiving the raw information about the sequenced genome to developing the formula that is the mRNA, the Moderna mRNA vaccine. 2 months later, after that, the first human stage 1 trials had begun. Many of you have now heard about these genetic variants, the South African variant, the Brazilian variant, because the virus is mutating. That's what viruses do. That's why viruses have been around for billions of years, is they have found a way to keep going, to keep propagating. But we now have an incredible tool, a platform tool in these mRNA vaccines that we have never previously had. And that's why there is going to be a back and forth between the viruses mutating, especially given that it's so widespread around the world, and are developing countermeasures, particularly through these kinds of of vaccines. But we shouldn't think in any way that the genetics revolution is about only vaccines, because it's about so much more. But our experience of the pandemic is already supercharging the genetics and biotech revolution in a manner similar to how World War II supercharged space travel and electronics and so many other radar and so many other technologies that came out of that global cataclysm. The first station along the way of the genetics revolution, as Robert so thoughtfully discussed, is our healthcare. And there are going to be three fundamental transformations in that process. The first is going to be a continued transition from our world of generalized healthcare based on population averages, which is the way most of us still experience healthcare today. If you have a headache, you take a Tylenol, and then you find out if you're one of the small percentage of people who can die from Tylenol by taking the Tylenol. But then we're moving toward a world, as Robert mentioned, of precision or personalized health, where you have a lot of information about who you are before an intervention. So you would know that you are the kind of person who shouldn't be taking a Tylenol, or that you may respond favorably or not well to a certain cancer treatment or any other kind of treatment for that matter. And so how are we going to know who you are on a cellular level and a biological level to make that determination? Well, certainly family history is very important. Biometric and other information is very important. But as Robert is today pioneering, the most important piece of medical information, the foundation of your electronic health record, will be your sequenced genome. And most everybody will, in the very near future, have their genome sequenced either before birth or likely immediately after birth, just like a heel prick blood test is now taken for kids in most developed parts of the world. So we'll have sequenced genomes, whole sequenced genomes, because the cost, as Robert mentioned, has gone to negligibility for hundreds of millions and then billions of people. We'll have electronic health records to be able to track relevant phenotypic or life information. And then we're going to use our tools of AI and big data analytics to draw out relevant lessons. If you only have genetic information, it's not really all that useful. You need genotypic, genetic, and phenotypic life information together in these massive databases. And that's what's going to allow us to transition from our world of precision healthcare based on understanding each person's individual biology to predictive healthcare, health, and life. Because when we have all of this genetic information, we're going to know a lot more about people's risks and people's opportunities from the moment of their birth. And that means that if a child is born and they have an elevated risk of, let's say, type 2 diabetes, we're going to know to try to educate them about diet and exercise maybe earlier in life than we otherwise would. If a child is born with a genetic predisposition to certain types of breast cancer, we're going to start and want to screen that child earlier than we would everybody else. But we don't have a disease genome. We don't have a healthcare genome. We have a human genome. And that leads me to the second change that we're going to experience. And that is that although the genetics revolution feels like it's all about healthcare today, over time, we're going to recognize that healthcare is just one application, one human application of the genetics revolution. Because when we have all of that predictive information, it's going to tell us all sorts of things about personality style, different ways of thinking, so many things that right now we ascribe to fate. We will increasingly be able to at least partly understand and partly predict within a range. That doesn't mean that our lives are going to be fated and fully known, but it does mean that we will learn more about different spectrums in which we exist. And our different traits, some of them are more genetic, like eye color, and some of them are a different balance between environmental and innate, like things like personality style. But human beings are, depending on what kind of analyses you look at, but based on 50 years of twin studies, we're kind of about half nature and half nurture. And this is going to shift the way we think about genetics. As I mentioned, right now, I'm sure a number of you have sent in your mouth swabs to companies like 23andMe, and you get information that's back from those companies on things like ancestry, which has nothing to do with healthcare. And right now, it's mildly interesting and not always fully accurate. But we're going to be able to have lots more information on many other things. So the second transformation for human applications is going to be genetics moving well beyond healthcare. And the third, and perhaps over time, the most fundamental application will be the way it changes reproduction. The genetics revolution will fundamentally over time transform not just the way we make babies, but the nature of the babies we make. We are increasingly going to have babies using the tools of IVF and embryo screening. And initially, the reason we're going to do that is because nature has an error rate. We call it random mutation in a Darwinian context. And as Robert mentioned, some of those mutations are helpful, some are harmful, and most don't have major consequence. But we will get to a point where using the tools of in vitro fertilization and embryo screening will allow us to have an error rate that is lower than nature. And that will be the threshold moment for convincing some potential parents that it will be safer to conceive through science than to conceive through sex. That's why I write about the coming end of sex. That doesn't mean I think people will stop having sex, but I do think that increasingly people will separate out conception and procreation from sex. And when they do that, in that process of embryo screening in stage 1, using a process called pre-implantation genetic testing, what we will do, and what is happening now, is embryos are grown to about 5 days. A few cells are extracted from each, and then they are sequenced. Again, as Robert mentioned, the cost of sequencing is trending toward 0. And with increasing information, we will be able to make more informed choice of which of, let's just say, for this case of this hypothetical, 10 embryos, which one will be implanted in the mother. Now, as I'll mention in a moment, this raises profound ethical questions, but parents will be faced with questions like, you have 10 embryos, one of them is carrying a deadly genetic disorder, which all but guarantees a painful early death. Would you select to implant that? Maybe some people would, and many others wouldn't. Do we think society should allow that kind of choice? Some societies will, and other societies won't. Right now, there's a limitation on the number of embryos that are available because of just built-in biology of human females. But there is a new-ish technology called induced pluripotent stem cells, for which Shinya Yamanaka won the 2012 Nobel Prize, that allows us to take an adult cell, let's say a skin cell, induce it into a stem cell, induce that stem cell into an egg cell, and egg cell into an egg. And now maybe we don't have 10 eggs, maybe we have 10,000. And using an automated process can then grow those 10,000 eggs for roughly five days, extract a few cells from each, sequence them, and then there is real choice. I know what I'm saying is scary to a lot of people. It's even scary to me. But what we're talking about are some pretty fundamental changes that in one way or another, that doesn't mean that everything I'm saying is inevitably going to happen, but that are going to change the way that we think about baby making. And many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the word CRISPR. Last year in 2020, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for developing the CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing tool, which was really amazing when they wrote this basic science paper in 2012. It was about how to edit the genome of a living cell using this basic science tool. 6 years later, in 2018, the world's first CRISPR-edited human babies were born through a highly unethical work of some call a rogue scientist, I call a scoundrel in China, frankly, who is now in prison. But it was 6 years between that basic science paper and the world's first 3 genome edited babies. As an aside, I'm a member of the World Health Organization International Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. And that's when our committee was created, because we realized, and Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the WHO, realized that this is an inflection point for the human species. And if we aren't careful, if we don't establish a values-driven governance system for these godlike technologies, we could end up stumbling into Nuremberg-style human experimentation. And that really is just unacceptable. But at the same time, we need to recognize that these technologies are here. They are now. It's easy to say, well, we should just not use them. But as Robert knows through his work, we have lots of people who are born with terrible, deadly genetic disorders that we can prevent, we can cure. And so the question can't be tech science and technology, yes or no. The question must be science and technology, how best? Because as I said in the beginning, this is ultimately a conversation about ethics. Many of you are of an age that you remember when we used to have these Ginsu knife commercials, and they would say, but wait, there's still more. But wait, there's still more. Remember I told you that the genetics revolution isn't just about healthcare? It's not. We are about to see, and this is relevant to where you are in South Dakota, a fundamental transformation in how we think about agriculture, not just the way we think about plants. And we're going to see a significant disruption of fertilizers. And instead of fertilizers, we're going to manipulate the microbiome, which lines the roots of plants, which will be a much healthier, more environmentally safe way to do farming. We're going to see the disruption of the cow through what's called cellular meat, which is in bioreactors growing meat, which will disrupt at least part of the cattle industry. We're going to see fundamental transformations in the way we generate energy. We're all familiar with ethanol, but there'll be many new forms of energy that will be brewed through manipulation of algae and other things. New ways of developing materials, nylons, spider silks, all kinds of materials that we once extracted, and in many cases in very costly ways from nature, we are going to be able to brew. We talked about the power of genetics, but genetics, DNA, is the greatest data storage mechanism in history. As a matter of fact, there was just a mammoth genome that was 1 million years old that was still readable. So we are at the early stages of DNA as a form of data storage, DNA data storage, which over time I think has a real potential to fundamentally transform the way we think about computer chips and data storage more generally. DNA is 1 million times denser than silicon. So this is a much, much bigger story. And it comes, I'm sure all of you who are listening are sitting at home thinking, wow, this seems really scary. It comes with a lot of dangers. These are technologies that could be abused. It could certainly be that if we're not careful, the application of genetic technologies could limit our genetic diversity even in the name of doing things that we like fighting or preventing disease. If we're not careful, as Robert says, the uneven application of these technologies could fundamentally undermine our equity, our togetherness as a species. And we need to be extremely mindful of that. And that's why I believe this moment, with all of its potential, comes with a tremendous amount of danger. And the challenge for all of us, the question for all of us, is what role can we play on an individual, on the communal, on a national, and on a global level to do our bit to make sure that these technologies are used in the wisest possible ways that enhance our humanity rather than undermine it. Because at this moment, big decisions are being made at every level. And if we aren't part of this process, it's going to be much more difficult to recognize what's happening 10 or 20 years from now and weigh in. And that's why I'm so pleased to speak with groups like yours. That's why I've written my book, Hacking Darwin, to try to make learning about the genetics revolution feel like a beach read. But it's not enough, I feel, and forgive me for this, for everyone just to come to an interesting talk and say, wow, that was interesting. Now that you're here, you are tapped. You are part of the process of ensuring that our greatest values guide the application of these very powerful technologies. And that's why, for me, speaking at a university like Augustana that is so committed to the application of values in life is such an honor. So let me end there and thank you, and remember that every day, imagine yourself shuffling out, let's say, to give your remarks in your great-grandchild's middle school. And what are you doing? What are we doing to make that the speech that people say, wow, you went through the pandemic years and you really found the light. So with that, would love to hear your thoughts and try to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Metzl, Dr. Green. Together, you have both made a number of very provocative points that we knew would be compelling. And I want to thank you both for your willingness to take some questions that have been submitted by a number of our students here at Augustana. Each of you touched on some of the topics that the students have identified in these questions, and so it gives you an opportunity to elaborate. I know the two of you work closely, so I'll let you determine who might want to respond to which question. I may reference something that I heard in your remarks as I pose those, and you can take it from there. But before I pose these questions, I'd like to thank Becca Lohman, Assistant Program Director for Genetic Counseling, Dr. Jeffrey Miller, Professor of English and Journalism, and Dr. Lisa Bay, Assistant Professor of Biology, for inviting students to share their questions. And our first one comes from Yvonne Cardona, a graduate student in genetic counseling. Here's her question. We know that currently the use of technologies like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and in vitro fertilization are not accessible to all. With that in mind, and looking towards the future of precision medicine, what structures are in place, if any, to address these equity issues? Are you partnered with any programs or institutions that examine the ethical, legal, and social implications of these technologies? Again, whether it was referencing the error rate lower than nature or some of what Dr. Green had mentioned, I think Yvonne's question, particularly as it relates to sequencing the human genome before birth, right, and how to address some equity issues are important there. So I'll turn it over to you.
So I think Robert and I both have thoughts on this. So if it's okay that I go first, Yvonne's question is really an essential one, and Robert mentioned it in his. Both Robert and I mentioned that in our remarks. These technologies don't come with built-in value systems. It's up to us to create the frameworks in which they operate. Right now, the United States has a terribly unequal healthcare system. So we have some people getting the best healthcare in the world and some people getting the worst healthcare in the world. And what we're finding now with this pandemic is that there's just one health, that either we're all safe or none of us are safe. That's actually the story of these variants. But those inequity issues are choices that we have made. We have made choices to allow our society and our healthcare to be incredibly unequal. In countries like Israel, where IVF and PGD are in some cases covered by their national health plans, they don't have those same equity issues. So I think we must be talking about equity right now in every conversation. But then we need to recognize that it's not something that it's not about expressing values, it's about making decisions about how our healthcare systems work and what we're paying for and what supports we're giving people. So certainly in my work with the World Health Organization, these equity issues are at the absolute center of everything that we're doing. And I know that Robert deals with these questions in a more of a clinical environment than I do. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Robert, as well.
Sure, beautifully said, Jamie. Yvonne, first of all, to you and to all the genetic counseling trainees and genetic counselors out there, thank you for getting me through my medical genetics fellowship. I just want to shout out to you and thank you for joining our program at Genomes to People, as so some of you have, and helping to make us successful. We are, each year we hire 1 or 2 genetic counselors. If you're interested in living in Boston, give me a shout. But just to add to what Jamie has said, you know, I work at a much more granular clinical research level. And what we're trying to do is expand within our sphere of influence what we can do to promote equity. And for me, that means making sure we are doing everything we can to partner with investigators and institutions that will help us recruit fairly. We're reaching out right now to some of the HBCUs, and some of them are interested in working with us on our expanded BabySeq project. We have gotten, we clawed a supplement out of NIH, which has allowed us to offer elective whole genome sequencing for free to any African American in the country. So, and we still have about 20 slots left. So if anybody in this audience wants to take advantage of that, please let us know. And we have 1 grant from NHLBI that's the first grant to return research results to the All African American Jackson Heart Study in Jackson, Mississippi. So at each of these junctures, you know, it's not fixing the system, which Jamie has alluded to. The system is broken and needs to be fixed. But where we can, we're trying to make, you know, inch by inch inroads into making sure that in terms of equity, in terms of research and clinical care, we pursue equity as much as we can.
Thank you both for your thoughtful responses to that important question. Our next question is from Noah Wicks, a journalism major. We may know about what the short-term effects of genetic engineering can be, but do we know if there are any genetic consequences down the line? How fast and effective can we be in the gene editing process while keeping the future impacts in mind?
Jamie, I'll lead into you on this, but I'll just say, before we can gene edit in a really responsible way, we're going to have hundreds of thousands, millions, and maybe even billions of genomes so that we know all the variation that's possible. So really what I've been talking about in preventive genomics, I think, is a stepping stone to gene editing writ large.
I think Robert is exactly right. But there's this conflict between having this technology that we already know is usable in humans and having the patience to wait until we are fully ready. As I have said from long ago, from the first announcement of these, that these first CRISPR babies had been born, the reason why I felt it was so unethical this was really gonzo science, that they had the ability to try, and it's not even clear it was successful, but it was done in a very non-transparent way, without safeguards, without state-of-the-art applications, without a serious conversation about what was being targeted. In this case, what He Jiankui, this Chinese biophysicist, was trying to do was not to cure some disease that these kids would have had, but to confer on them some additional future resistance should they be exposed to HIV. So it was a pure enhancement. But when I take a step back and say, well, what would have been the right first step in genome editing humans, it's not impossible to come up with an answer that doesn't require the full understanding of the human genome, which may take centuries to achieve. What it could be would be, I don't want to get back into the genetics course. I think Robert gave us everything that we need, but either with two recessive parents, or a dominant and a recessive parent with a single embryo, so who wanted to have their own genetically related child. And so then the question is, if we know a child is going to be born with some deadly or terrible single gene mutation disorder, there are different ways that we can think about how we might respond. One is to have the child be born and then try to treat that disease. And in lots of these diseases aren't treatable. So we have a child born, and we perhaps know that that child is going to die, although sometimes there are diseases that weren't treatable that become treatable. We're starting to see that with gene therapy for sickle cell disease. Or there are interventions that are fetal surgeries, which is becoming much more powerful and effective. Or there could be an intervention at the stage of a pre-implanted embryo. And so you could say, well, editing, making a single gene mutation to a pre-implanted embryo, that's crossing a line, it's playing God. But if you could make that intervention and you could change the life story from a child born with a deadly disorder to a child who lives to be 90 or 100 and has a full life and writes poetry and spreads love and does all of these things, would that intervention be worthwhile? And it's my personal view that it would be with the right safeguards. And so the question, had He Jiankui not taken that fateful step in 2018, early in 2018, when I was writing and thinking and speaking about this, when did I think that step would have been taken? I would have guessed somewhere between 5 to 10 years in the future, not 100 years, 5 to 10 years. And then our interventions will become increasingly complicated as our understanding becomes increasingly sophisticated. It's never going to be that having a baby is like going to the Build-A-Bear showroom at the mall where you say, I'll take this, this, and this, and they just put it in and a baby pops out. But our ability to intervene for many reasons that I think many people would say are justifiable will increase over time. And with that, our sense of choice and possibility will also increase, and different societies are going to think about that differently. And that's why now is the time that it's so important that we be having these kinds of conversations, so we can start to figure out, well, what do we mean? What do we want? Who are we? And how can we realize that in our individual decisions, in the norms that we have, in the laws on a national and on a global level?
Well, the example that you've cited now in terms of the lack of transparency gets to the next question and provides a good segue. It's from Julia Johnson, also a journalism major. She poses this question: while genetic engineering has the promise and power to help humanity medically and socially, it also presents dangers. You've both referred to that. As genetic engineering becomes more accessible to different agents through biohacking, how do you think control of the market can be implemented so that people outside the lab don't have the opportunity to abuse or misuse its powers? Is regulation even possible?
I have thoughts. Robert, do you want to go first? I'm happy to go first or second.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought as much about the gene editing future as you have, but I'll just say I think regulation is possible. I also think that people, I mean, journalism, two questions from journalism just reminds me so much how important it is for people to be able to distinguish truth from fiction. Right now, there are hundreds of millions of dollars in probably 1,000 different biotech companies that are doing one thing or another with the genome, a third of which may be thinking about editing the genome. Unregulated, and I'm not just talking about their science, I'm talking about their advertising, their marketing, they will foist on a naive public all sorts of mythology about what they're offering at a price. And what worries me a lot in this onslaught of capital and onslaught of investment and the nimbleness of companies next to us sluggish academics is, how do we make sure that the country is able to distinguish advertising and exaggeration and outright fraud from real science and nuanced science and limitations of science? So for those of you in journalism, I think I think the science journalism is a noble part of your profession and a tough one, but I think it's going to become increasingly important to marshal regulation and marshal public opinion in the right ways as these technologies become available. Over to you, Jamie.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And to break that great question into two parts. First is biohacking, and second is governance. Biohacking is real. This technology is decentralized technology. Everybody knows about the Manhattan Project. You needed a whole government and huge amounts of money in order to build a nuclear weapon. And for years, the idea has been that it took a state or something kind of like a state to build a nuclear weapon. When He Jiankui helped genetically alter these embryos, it wasn't that he was the only person in the world who could have done that. My guess is there were 30,000 people who had that same technical ability, any of whom could have done that. We're as the question mentioned, we are in this age of DIY biohacking. And on one hand, that's really scary. I think some people have seen the Unnatural Selection series on HBO, where this kind of crazy guy, Josiah Zayner, is giving himself all kinds of strange shots and things like that. And we recognize that as bad. We also recognize that the hobbyists like Steve Wozniak helped build the era of the personal computer. So there's a lot that's positive in these biospaces and DIY bio, that science and technology is moving beyond the labs. But we need to have regulatory infrastructures, both for what happens in the labs and what happens outside of the labs. Because right now, I mean, it's a different part of my life. I'm knee deep in exploring this question of where does COVID come from originally. And one of the very real possibilities is that it's an accidental escape from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But we have all of these kinds of virology institutes around the world that are doing all kinds of very aggressive work. But we don't have global regulatory infrastructures. It's the same as our work with the WHO. And that's why this issue of governance is really essential. And governance isn't just laws. It's what happens at every level. It's what happens with internal review boards at hospitals, with publications deciding what to publish, with grant providers building in safeguards, yes, with laws. And what we're seeing is that many of these issues are global. When these Chinese CRISPR babies were born, that wasn't just relevant to China, it was relevant to humanity. although no regulators in any other part of the world could have had any ability to influence what was happening in China. I think that could be part of the COVID origin story now. And that's what brings me back to what I was saying in the beginning, is that we are at a moment where our science is advancing exponentially, but our regulatory infrastructures are really only inching forward glacially. And that's a mismatch that we must address urgently.
Well, thank you both for encouraging our future journalists, our graduates here at Augustana, but the important role that they'll play both on the science side of journalism as well as on the government, politics, and regulatory side. The next set of questions come from students currently taking cell biology. The first is from Abby Funky, biology major, and Courtney Crystal, government and international affairs and biology majors. And it gets to the point that you just made, Dr. Metzl. Medicine, though traditionally seen as reactionary, has proven to have preventive practices as well, such as Dr. Green's Preventive Genomics Clinic. However, each of you has some or extensive experience in policy. How can preventive methodology translate into policy, especially as it relates to biotechnology? Can policy be proactive, or similar to the traditional view of medicine, can it only be reactionary?
Amy, you want to start this one?
Yeah, sure. So what a wonderful question. It just, I love these questions make me happy. The fact that we're not there meeting with these students and then, staying 3 hours after to answer all the questions makes me a little sad, because these are just wonderful questions, and kudos to everybody at the Augustana community for being so thoughtful in this important conversation. So certainly when we think about proactive health, it's a different way of thinking about healthcare, because right now what we call healthcare is sick care. Somebody shows up because something is being manifest, and whether it's a tumor or any other kind of terrible symptomatic manifestation, and then we treat that symptom. But there are, in some cases, for many of these genetic disorders, the beginnings of that problem were there just after conception, or maybe in some cases even before conception. And so intervening at the most appropriate time is the future of healthcare. It's cheaper, it's better, it prevents all kinds of suffering, but we need to change all sorts of things to make that possible. I mean, that's why Robert made his disclosures. My disclosure is I'm on Robert's advisory board for his wonderful BabySeq project. And the reason why, I don't want to steal your thunder, but I'm so proud of it. The reason why it's so important is to be able to show that having that kind of information allows a preventive intervention that is cheaper and better than just waiting for problems to play out. But it requires a whole shift in how we do all sorts of things, including pay bills. If you show up in your hospital and you have a massive tumor, that's like a big, I hate to say it, it's a financial big win for the hospital. If you show up and you say, hey, I may have a tumor 10 years from now, there's not something to be paid for. And as a matter of fact, the average American changes health insurance plans every 18 months. So your health insurance has absolutely no stake in spending money that could protect you 10 or 20 years from now. And I think it's a great analog for policy, because on one hand, you don't want policies to be too aggressive that can kill the science, but you also don't want them to be so slow that there's this massive lag and all kinds of terrible things happen. And so certainly one of the reasons why I spend a decent amount of my time focusing on speaking and reaching out to government officials is that we have a very low level of scientific literacy among our elected officials. In my book, Hacking Darwin, it's the reason why I have a political guide of questions that people can ask people who are running for office. And so I think it's critically important, and that's an area where I think the Augustana students, in light of all of this wonderful thoughtfulness could really play a role, and you could have meaningful conversations even at a state level that I think could be a model for the rest of the country. Robert?
Yeah, I can't add much to that. But Abby and Courtney, the incentives are all misaligned. As Jamie said, we're paid to do things, procedures, and we're paid for sick care, and we're not paid for preventive care. Ironically, because we're so terrified about life insurance discrimination in genetics, but ironically, it's the life insurance companies that are most incentivized once you've bought your life insurance to keep you alive, right? The longer you live, the more profit they make. So ironically, it's actually some of the largest life insurance companies in the world that are taking the genomic revolution seriously in terms of prevention. Who would have thought? Because they're like the devil to most of us in genetics until we actually realize that they've got a reason to care. In terms of what else you can do, I think educate yourself as you're doing now, and as those of you who are interested in biology, genetic counseling, I would argue that only if you want to, you should consider getting yourself sequenced and getting yourself, if you can't afford the full sequencing, which is a couple $1,000s, get one of the panels that's for a couple hundred genes, and that's as low as $250. I would say keep learning about genomics at every level and confronting these issues. And as Jamie said, confront your politicians with real science and real fact so that we just don't get bowled over by pseudoscience as we so often do.
Wonderful. I hope some of our students, maybe at the president's encouragement, will take you up on that idea because as a smaller state, we do have good relationships and access to our public officials at every level of government. So thank you for that idea. Our next question is from Theron Liggins, biochemistry major, Sarah Al-Hasnawi, biochemistry and Spanish majors, and Anna Gross, biochemistry major. And this prompts me to think of the term you used, Dr. Green, of genomic apartheid in terms of these students' question. With systemically non-dominant populations' genomes understudied compared to others, how do your research practices provide the same outcomes for patients from each of these populations?
Wonderful question. Well, I don't know if they do. In the arena, remember I defined those sort of 4 categories of genetic information. So the dominant, monogenic dominance, although we have probably discovered fewer mutations in minority populations, the ones we have discovered are probably pan-ethnic. So there's not going to be, if we can get people tested, the BRCA1 pathogenic mutation in a white person is going to be, as best we know now, similar to the impact on a Black person or a Hispanic person or an Asian person. In terms of the recessive carrier traits, pretty much the same thing as best we know now. In terms of the pharmacogenetics and the polygenic risk scores, they're clearly different, and the outcomes are not as well known. They simply aren't. So the trick here is twofold. In fact, there's a tension here. Do you not offer these to anybody in the name of equity? Do you offer them only to white people, which seems kind of wrong, to do only to white people because you don't have good data for other ethnicities? Do you offer to both, but say to the Black person whom you're offering, listen, I want you to have the advantage of this, but you need to know it's not quite as accurate because it's based on European populations, but it still might be better than nothing. So you've got some really real questions that don't have good answers in the here and now. In the next 5 years, we absolutely, and this is underway thanks to NIH and other groups, we absolutely have to catch up with this information from disadvantaged and minority populations, and just frankly, all ethnicities around the world. We have to catch up and make those variants and variations available to researchers. And that just has to be done so that we can close the gap instead of widening the gap.
Thank you, Dr. Green. Our final question from students is from Jace Grostidier, biology major. And Dr. Metzl, you had mentioned about the idea of this is all racing forward. You gave the example of the vaccine within 48 hours having the formula. And so Jace's question is this: the fields of human genetics and genome mapping have advanced at an incredible speed over the past few decades. Editing of known genes has become relatively simple, and the cost of mapping a human genome has fallen substantially. Are we on the verge of moving into an age of genomics-based healthcare, or do we need to improve programs, instruments, and models before distribution of genomic treatments becomes a mainstream talking point?
Another great question I think for both of us. And so my short answer is yes and yes. We are on the verge of a quantum leap, as I mentioned in my remarks, in how we think about health, the provision of healthcare, and just how the body works. And it's not just genetics. Genetics is an incredibly complex ecosystem, but set within the systems of systems, what we call systems biology. But the basic point is that the complexity of our biology is roughly the same as it's been for millions of years, but the sophistication of our tools is increasing at an exponential rate. So there will come a time when the sophistication of our tools meets and then exceeds the complexity of our biology. And so we are moving into this new framework, and we're not ready for it. That's the basic thing. And we're not ready for it because we don't fully understand these systems. I mean, we're in many ways like adolescents with these very powerful tools, and we haven't figured out how to use them. And we're still at a relatively early stage of this revolution. But this revolution, barring some kind of massive catastrophe, I mean, not a pandemic, because the pandemic has only accelerated it, but maybe some climate change induced disaster or something else. But barring that, I mean, this revolution is racing forward, and it's going to change so many aspects of our lives. And as I said in my remarks, the question is, can we be not perfectly ready? We're not going to be perfectly ready because it's a constantly moving target. Can we be as ready as we possibly can be? And what's each of our responsibility to get there?
I started off my remarks saying, why isn't your doctor offering you genomics? And if you ask your doctor the next time you see him or her, he or she will probably say, because they don't reimburse me for it. And then if you ask your healthcare insurance company why they don't reimburse, they'll say, because the United States Preventive Services Task Force hasn't given it an A grade. And if you ask the United States Preventive Services Task Force why they haven't given it an A grade, they'll say, because there's not clear-cut randomized control evidence of benefit and cost effectiveness. And when you ask an investigator like me, why haven't you done that? It's because it's a lot of rare conditions and it's a lot of complexity. It's not one pill or one surgical intervention. So part of the work that I've been working on is trying to devise ways of getting that key evidence and showing it to the world so that all of the people in that cycle, instead of being a cycle of denial, becomes a cycle of affirmation. And but evidence is not going to be enough. Everybody in this audience has to think about this, as Jamie has said, read about it, read his book, read the literature, and go out there and change attitudes. There is a defensive crouch in medicine right now. Oh, I can't do this because it might be a little too far ahead and we won't get paid for it. And my senior investigators say I can't do it. Let's take care of patients. Let's take care of our researchers, research participants, but let's be bold and let's weigh what the benefits that we're not giving people against the delays that it's taking to roll these technologies out. So I want to thank you as well, because, and I wish I was there talking to you in person, and I will actually be back on a regular basis to Sanford when the world opens up. So I hope, Stephanie, that I can stop by and see you and folks there, and we can keep these conversations going.
And meet some of these students. I have one more question, but I want to just do a quick follow-up to Jace's question and your response, Dr. Green. Does this all, both of you had mentioned sort of different funding, right? Does this come down to, like we just saw worldwide, to create these vaccines so quickly, a concerted effort nationally and worldwide as it relates to the funding associated with the type of investigation that will lead to that evidence, as well as part of the public awareness campaign?
That's absolutely part of it.
Yeah, I think so. And what else is, because this is some of the work that I'm doing with the World Health Organization. This is the big challenge that we face, is that these are global issues. We're talking about the future of healthcare, the future of humanity ultimately. But while the challenges are global, our primary unit of organization is national. And that's why there's this mismatch between global problems and not global solutions. So the institutions that we have aren't really up to snuff. They aren't what we need. And so this plane is flying. While it's flying, we're needing to remodel it, to build on new kinds of things. And it's really hard. And that's why it's such an honor to be here with your students. And that's why I hope that if one takeaway that your students have from this is really exciting, it's really challenging. The 21st century is the century of biology. What can I do, not just to be part of that, but to shape it? And that's a pretty exciting future that I think we all can share.
It is, and one of the things that we do here at Augustana, within all of our degrees, and the type of collaboration that faculty pursue to ensure that our students, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in the community, but also around the country, around the world with study abroad programs, courses, is cultivating that global perspective. And so that's a good segue to the final question. And I know we're running a little over 9 o'clock, but a final question I think is so important, Dr. Metzl, given what you just stated in terms of the airplane is flying, right? And so we sort of need to know if there are some fundamental flaws, or if we've got someone who's trying to sabotage the plane while we're already in the air. And so here's the question that was submitted on behalf of the Center for Western Studies Board of Directors. Dr. Metzl, you've stated that the pandemic was a totally preventable event. You've been among those who last year called for a full, unrestricted international forensic investigation into the origins of the pandemic. You've demanded full access to all necessary data, records, and personnel in China and elsewhere. Recently, you helped organize an open letter signed by 26 scientists from around the world, published in the Wall Street Journal, which questions the integrity and credibility of the World Health Organization investigation of the origins of COVID-19. So please comment on the danger of an even worse disaster in the future if the world permits a cover-up.
Thank you so much for asking this question. And I know that we're over time, but I'm so passionate about this. So if I can just take a little bit of time. One of the reasons why I was probably the leading international voice early last year, raising questions about the origins of COVID, is it just didn't make sense to me that we have a bat coronavirus, but the outbreak isn't in southern China, where they have these kinds of horseshoe bats, but it's more than 1,000 miles north in a city that I had visited just before then, that I knew was a very sophisticated, very wealthy city where there's not a lot of yokels eating bats. But what they do have is China's only level 4 virology institute that has the world's largest collection of bat coronaviruses, that is doing gain of function research, exposing these viruses to humanized mice, where the genomes of the mice were altered to give them human ACE2 receptors, which is where the spike protein of the virus docks on the human genome. And so of all the places, of all the gin joints and all the towns in all the world, as Humphrey Bogart says, we have an outbreak of a bat coronavirus fully adapted to humans just around the corner of this laboratory. It seemed, well, that seems like something worthy of investigating. And so I encourage everybody to go to my jamiemetzl.com website. In the blog section, I have, it's now 40 pages long in English and Chinese on the origins of SARS-CoV-2. And I lay out the evidence. And I can't say for sure it was a laboratory accident. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. It could also have been a series of zoonotic jumps through intermediate animal hosts in the wild, although to date, there's no evidence of that. So what I've called for is a full and unrestricted international forensic investigation into the origins of the pandemic. And I was, so there was and is this independent advisory committee to the World Health Organization, who had essentially a 2-week study tour in Wuhan. And then on February 9th, and I'm sorry to go on, but you kind of hit a nerve here, and I'm very passionate. On February 9th, they had a press event in Wuhan, which was a joint event of this advisory committee, independent advisory committee to the WHO and the Chinese government. And they were the ones who said, we shouldn't investigate the lab leak, which in my view is the most likely hypothesis, but still a hypothesis. And we should investigate this frozen food hypothesis that it came from maybe some other country and somebody shipped it to Wuhan, which in my view is still a hypothesis, but extremely unlikely. And so we had a group of academics from around the world who'd been meeting for months privately, sharing information, sharing data, presenting papers to each other, challenging each other, trying to answer this question of where COVID comes from. And when they had that press event, I certainly put out a statement. I contacted my friends at the WHO, and I was pleased that Dr. Tedros, the director, 3 days later put out a statement essentially refuting what happened at that press event. And then I led the process organizing the scientists in this community that we already had to put together and then release our open letter. And our view is, and I feel it should be everybody's view, is that we have this terrible pandemic, worst pandemic in a century. Nearly 2.5 million people are dead. Billions of people's lives have been disrupted. We owe every person on Earth and future generations, as you mentioned, Stephanie, a full and unrestricted forensic investigation into the origins of the pandemic with full access to all samples, records, and personnel. And unfortunately, China to date has not allowed that. And that's why I think it's not about pointing fingers. It's about if a plane crashes, we say, why did the plane crash? Because other planes could have those same vulnerabilities. And that's what we need to do here.
Well, highlighting the importance of scientific inquiry, independent inquiry, so that we can uncover the truth and the inquiry that the public has for true accountability and applying lessons learned going forward. Dr. Metzl, Dr. Green, thank you so much again for sharing your insights and your expertise with us this evening. Your work and the advances made in understanding the human genome are truly remarkable. The possibilities ahead are exciting and complex and will require future thought leaders who possess knowledge, understanding, empathy, and a global perspective. I have every confidence that among those thought leaders will be Augustana University graduates whose immersion in a strong liberal arts education will prepare and serve them well to seize the opportunities and to meet the challenges associated with improving the human condition in the rapidly changing world around us. Thank you to all who joined us this evening for this first ever virtual Boe Forum. We look forward to the day when we can gather together in larger groups on campus once again. Until then, be safe, be well, God bless, and from all of us here at Augustana University, we wish each of you the very best throughout 2021. Good night.